On Christmas Eve, the house was quiet in that dangerous way, where every sound feels louder than it should, and when I finally asked my son's wife about the money missing from my account, I expected excuses, maybe lies, maybe tears, but not what came next, because my own son stepped forward first, his eyes, hold his voice flat, and in that moment I realized I was no longer his father. I was an obstacle. They needed gone. The argument exploded, fast words turned into shoves. I hit the floor, tasted blood, and heard them say, "Stay away from us," like I was already erased. And I left that night injured, humiliated, and more alone than I had ever been. But here is what they never understood. Silence is not weakness, it is preparation. 2 days later, my phone rang and I already knew his voice before he spoke because desperation always sounds the same. "Dad," he said, "did you pay the mortgage this month?" And in that pause between his question and my answer, everything shifted. Years of sacrifice, nights I stayed strong. After losing the woman I loved, trust I handed over without question. It all came into focus, and I realized this was not just about money. This was about control, betrayal, and the final mistake they made. Thinking I was finished, I answered him with 4 words that would change everything. And from that moment on, the roles reversed, because the man they dismissed, the man they hurt, was no longer begging for respect. He was reclaiming it. "If you stay with me, you will see how cruelty exposes greed, how betrayal reveals truth, and how patience becomes the sharpest weapon of all." This is not just a story about revenge. It is about a father who was pushed too far, and the lesson his son and daughter-in-law would never forget if they stayed until the very end. My name is Walter Caldwell. I am 68 years old, a retired accountant who spent 40 years helping small businesses keep their books straight and their futures secure. My wife Eleanor passed away 10 months ago, and since then I have learned that grief is not something you get over, it is something you learn to carry. Christmas Eve arrived the way it always does, with the smell of pine needles and the weight of memories too heavy to set down. I stood in the kitchen of the house Eleanor and I shared for 4 decades, stirring a pot of soup I did not feel like eating. The radio played carols I could not bring myself to turn off because she had loved them so much. Her favorite chair sat empty by the window, the cushion still holding the shape of her body even after all these months. I had not been able to bring myself to sit in it. Some things belong to the dead, and we should not disturb them. Before starting dinner, I walked to the windowsill where Eleanor's white lilies bloomed in their ceramic pot. I filled my watering can and tended to them the way I had every single day since she passed. She planted them 3 years ago, told me they needed attention and consistency to thrive. I think now that she was teaching me something I would not understand until she was gone. The ritual has become my morning prayer, my evening confession, my only remaining conversation with the woman I loved for 43 years. After the lilies were watered, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop to pay the monthly bills. It was a habit Eleanor and I shared. She handled the big picture. I handled the details. Now I handle everything alone. I logged into our savings account, the one we had built together over a lifetime of careful choices and small sacrifices. The balance should have read just over $60,000. Instead, the number staring back at me was $13,000 and change. My hands went cold. I scrolled through the transaction history, my heart pounding harder with each line. $47,000 gone. Electronic transfers made over the past 2 weeks, amounts ranging from $3,000 to $8,000 at a time. I did not authorize these. I did not even know they were happening. I called the bank immediately. The representative was polite but unhelpful at first, reading from a script about security procedures and verification steps. But when I pressed her, she confirmed what I already feared. The account had been accessed using Eleanor's old login credentials. Someone had used my dead wife's information to steal from me. The IP address traced back to a location I recognized, my son Daniel's house. I sat there for a long time after hanging up, the laptop screen glowing in the dim kitchen. My eyes drifted to the mantel where Eleanor's photograph smiled at me from its silver frame. She looked the way she always did, calm, knowing, like she could see around corners. I could not. I remembered something then that I had tried not to think about. In her final months, Eleanor made phone calls she never explained. She would be talking softly in the bedroom, and the moment I walked in, she would hang up and change the subject. I never pushed her. I trusted her completely, and I assumed she would tell me when she was ready. She never did. Now I sat in our empty kitchen on Christmas Eve, robbed by my own family, and I wondered what secrets my wife had carried to her grave. The soup grew cold on the stove. I turned off the burner, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the falling snow. The drive to Daniel's house took 20 minutes, though I barely remember the roads. My mind was full of numbers that did not add up and questions I did not want to ask. When I arrived, I did not pull into the driveway. I parked across the street and sat in the darkness, watching the warm light spill from their windows. Through the glass, I could see them, Daniel, Melissa, and a table set for a feast. They were laughing. My son threw his head back at something his wife said, and she touched his arm with an easy affection I had not seen directed at me in years. The Christmas tree glittered behind them. The turkey sat golden and perfect at the center of the table. They had not invited me. They had not even called. And somewhere in that house, on a computer connected to their wireless network, someone had used my wife's name to steal everything we had saved. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, snow settling on my shoulders like a warning I was too angry to heed. The doorbell echoed through the house like an accusation. I stood on the porch with snow melting on my shoulders, watching the shapes move behind the frosted glass. Melissa opened the door, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face, surprise, then calculation, then a smile so practiced it could have been painted on. "Walter," she said, her voice dripping with warmth that did not reach her eyes. "What a surprise. We didn't expect you tonight." "Clearly," I replied. I stepped inside without waiting to be invited. The house smelled of roasted turkey and expensive candles. The dining table was set with Eleanor's good china pieces Melissa had asked to borrow 2 years ago and never returned. Daniel rose from his seat, napkin still tucked into his collar, his face cycling through emotions too fast for me to read. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I did not answer him. I walked straight to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from Melissa. She remained standing, her smile frozen in place like a mask she had forgotten to remove. $47,000, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. Gone from our savings account over the past 2 weeks. Electronic transfers, every single one traced to this address. The room went silent. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate. Melissa's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes shifted, a door closing, a lock clicking into place. "Walter." She said my name the way you might address a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. She sat down slowly, folding her hands on the table like a teacher preparing to explain something very simple to a very slow student. "You're getting confused. It happens at your age. Memory lapses, forgotten authorizations. You probably set up those transfers yourself and don't remember." "I did not authorize anything. Are you sure?" She tilted her head, her voice soft with false concern. "Because Daniel mentioned you've been having trouble lately. Forgetting appointments, losing your keys. It's nothing to be ashamed of. My grandmother went through the same thing before she—" "I am not your grandmother." I cut her off, my hands flat on the table. "And I am not confused." The bank confirmed it. Someone used Eleanor's login credentials. Someone in this house. I turned to Daniel. My son sat rigid in his chair, staring at his plate like it contained the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. His hands trembled when he reached for his wine glass, and he drank deeply before setting it down with a thud. "Daniel, look at me." He would not. His eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth, on the candles, on anything but my face. "Dad, just drop it." His voice cracked on the last word. "Melissa handles our finances. She knows what she's doing. If she says you authorized it, then maybe you did and forgot. You believe that?" He did not answer. But Melissa shot him a look I will never forget. Sharp, warning, the kind of glance that carries the weight of secrets and threats. Daniel's shoulders curled inward like a beaten dog retreating from a raised hand. Whatever passed between them in that moment, I did not understand it. But I knew it was not the look a wife gives a husband. It was the look a handler gives an animal that has stepped out of line. Melissa's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, and her entire demeanor changed. The color drained from her face. She stood abruptly, already lifting the phone to her ear. "Excuse me, I have to take this." She walked into the kitchen, but the house was old and the walls were thin. I heard her whisper, sharp and urgent. "Mom, I told you next week. I'll have it next week. Just wait." A pause. "I'm handling it." I said, "I'm handling it." When she returned, her smile was back, brighter than before, brittle as cheap glass. She smoothed her blouse and sat down as if nothing had happened. Where were we? Oh, yes. Walter's memory problems. There is nothing wrong with my memory. I stood now, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I want answers. I want to know where my money went and why you thought you could steal from me using my dead wife's name. Steal? Melissa's voice rose an octave. She stood to meet me, and the mask finally cracked. You come into my house on Christmas Eve and accuse me of stealing after everything I've done for this family? I'm the one who takes care of Daniel. I'm the one who manages everything while you sit alone in that empty house talking to a dead woman's flowers. Melissa Daniel started. No. She pointed at me, her finger trembling with rage. You don't get to come here and throw accusations around. You're a bitter old man who can't accept that his son has his own life now. Maybe Eleanor kept secrets from you because she knew you couldn't handle the truth. Maybe she knew exactly what kind of man you really are. The mention of Eleanor's name in that tone broke something inside me. I stepped toward Melissa, words rising in my throat that I would never get the chance to speak. Because in that moment, hands shoved me hard from behind. I stumbled backward, my hip catching the corner of the dining table, my arms flailing for balance I could not find. The world tilted. I heard Eleanor's china crash to the floor, then my head struck something solid, and the room exploded into white light and ringing silence. When my vision cleared, I was on the ground. Blood trickled warm and wet down my temple, pooling in the hollow of my eye. The chandelier above me fractured into 1,000 glittering pieces, and standing over me, frozen in place, pale as death, was my son Daniel. His hands were still raised. His wedding ring caught the light like a blade. He had pushed me, not Melissa. My own son had put his hands on me and shoved me to the ground. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was his face not angry, not triumphant, but terrified. Like a man who had just realized he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The ceiling spun above me in slow circles, the chandelier's crystals bleeding into streaks of light that made no sense. I could hear voices, but they came from far away, muffled like sounds through deep water. Someone was screaming. Someone else was saying words I could not piece together. The blood from my temple had reached my ear now, warm and thick, and the hardwood floor beneath my back was cold enough to seep through my shirt and settle into my bones. Call an ambulance, Melissa's voice cut through the fog. He's bleeding. We have to call someone. No. Daniel's voice, sharp and final. He's fine. He just fell. He's fine. I tried to speak, to tell them I was not fine, that nothing about this moment was fine, but my tongue felt thick and useless in my mouth. My eyes focused slowly, painfully, on the ceiling medallion above me. Eleanor had picked that medallion when we helped Daniel and Melissa move in 3 years ago. She said it reminded her of the one in our first apartment, back when we had nothing but each other and a love stubborn enough to build a life on. My mind began to clear in fragments. The argument, Melissa's pointed finger, the shove from behind. I replayed the moment over and over, trying to make sense of what my body already knew. I had been facing Melissa when the hand struck my back. The force came from behind me, from where Daniel had been sitting. And in that frozen instant before I fell, I had seen something, a flash of gold on the left hand that pushed me. A wedding ring. On the left hand, Melissa always wore her ring on her right hand. She made a point of telling everyone it was the European style, the sophisticated way, as if the placement of jewelry could make her better than the rest of us. I had heard her explain it 100 times at family gatherings, her voice dripping with condescension. The hands that pushed me wore the ring on the left. Those hands belonged to Daniel. The realization hit me harder than the fall. My own son had put his hands on my back and shoved me to the ground. Not in a moment of confusion, not by accident. He had chosen to do it. He had chosen her over me. I rolled onto my side and pushed myself up slowly, every joint protesting, every muscle screaming. The room tilted and I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. Blood dripped onto Eleanor's white tablecloth, spreading in small crimson blooms across the linen she had embroidered by hand 30 years ago. No one moved to help me. I looked at Daniel. My son stood exactly where he had been when I fell, his arms now hanging limp at his sides, his face the color of old paper. I searched his eyes for something: remorse, guilt, an explanation, anything that might help me understand how we had arrived at this moment. He would not meet my gaze. His eyes darted to the floor, to the wall, to Melissa, anywhere but my face. "Daniel." My voice came out as a rasp. "Look at me." He did not. Melissa stepped between us, smoothing her blouse as if the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than an awkward interruption to her dinner party. Her composure had returned completely, her face arranged into an expression of patient concern that fooled no one. "I think it's best if you leave, Walter." Her voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone managing a difficult situation with admirable restraint. "You're clearly not well. You've had some kind of episode. We can discuss all of this after the holidays, when everyone has calmed down." An episode. I repeated the word like it was spoken in a foreign language. "Your husband just assaulted me. You fell." She said it simply, as if stating an obvious fact. "You got upset and you fell. It happens to people your age. No one is blaming you." I stood there, blood drying on my face, and understood with perfect clarity that there would be no justice in this room. Not tonight, perhaps not ever. Melissa had already written the story she would tell, and Daniel had already chosen which version of events he would remember. At 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve, my daughter-in-law walked me to the front door. She retrieved my coat from the closet and handed it to me the way you might hand a receipt to a delivery driver, efficiently, impersonally, eager to complete the transaction. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said quietly. "Go home. Get some rest. We'll talk when you're thinking more clearly." The door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying snowflakes that melted against my bloody face. I stepped out onto the porch, and before I could turn around, the door closed behind me with a soft, decisive click. I stood alone in the falling snow, 68 years old, bleeding from a wound my own son had given me, with nowhere to go on the coldest night of the year. The windows glowed golden and warm behind me. Through the glass, I heard Melissa say something I could not make out, and then I heard her laugh. It was a bright, careless sound, the laugh of someone who had just won a game she had been playing for a very long time. I wiped the blood from my eye and walked toward my car. The snow was falling harder now, covering my footprints as quickly as I made them, erasing the evidence that I had ever been there at all. The Pine Ridge Motor Lodge sat on the eastern edge of town where the highway curved toward the mountains, and respectable people rarely had reason to stop. I pulled into the parking lot at nearly midnight, my headlights sweeping across cracked asphalt and a flickering neon sign that advertised vacancies in letters missing half their glow. The night clerk barely looked at me when I paid cash for 3 nights. He slid a key across the counter and went back to his television without asking about the blood-dried dark against my temple. The room smelled of mildew and old cigarette smoke, the kind of smell that seeps into the walls and never leaves. The carpet was stained in patterns I chose not to examine. The heater rattled and coughed beneath the window like a dying animal struggling for breath. I locked the door behind me, drew the curtains against the parking lot lights, and stood for a long moment in the darkness before I could make myself move again. In the bathroom, I confronted my reflection under the buzzing fluorescent light. The gash on my temple was worse than I had allowed myself to believe, nearly 2 inches long, the edges ragged and angry, still seeping blood when I pressed too hard. It needed stitches. A doctor would have cleaned it properly, checked for concussion, sent me home with antibiotics and instructions for care. But doctors cost money, and hospitals ask questions, and I no longer had $47,000 to spare for either. I cleaned the wound as best I could with motel soap and paper towels that felt like sandpaper against my skin. I fashioned a bandage from the cleanest washcloth I could find and taped it in place with supplies from the first aid kit Eleanor had insisted I keep in my glove compartment. Even now, she was still taking care of me. For 2 days, I did not leave that room. I sat in the chair by the window and watched cars pass on the highway, their headlights cutting through the gray December fog like promises no one intended to keep. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the 40 years we spent building a life together, the sacrifices we made, the arguments we survived, the quiet moments that meant more than either of us ever said aloud. She would have known what to do. She always knew. She would have seen through Melissa the moment that woman walked into our lives, would have recognized the calculation behind those pretty smiles and practiced gestures. Eleanor had a gift for seeing people clearly, for understanding what they wanted before they knew themselves. I should have listened to her more. I should have asked more questions. I should have paid attention to the signs I was too comfortable to notice. On the second evening, I pulled out my wallet to count what little cash remained. Behind the bills, tucked into the sleeve where I kept my insurance cards, I found Eleanor's last driver's license photo. I had put it there after she died, unable to leave it in a drawer where I would never see it. Her face smiled up at me, patient and knowing, her eyes holding secrets I was only now beginning to suspect. Behind the photo, I found something I had forgotten entirely. A folded slip of paper, soft with age, covered in Eleanor's careful handwriting. A phone number with no name, underlined 3 times in blue ink. Beneath it, a single word. Emergency. I stared at that word until my eyes burned. Emergency. She had written it deliberately, underlined the number as if willing me to understand its importance. How long had this been in my wallet? When had she slipped it there? And why had she never told me? The memories came flooding back then, sharper than they had been in months. Eleanor's final weeks, when the cancer had already taken hold, but before the worst of it set in. The private phone calls she made behind closed doors, conversations she ended the moment I entered the room. The afternoon she disappeared for 3 hours and returned looking tired but strangely peaceful, refusing to explain where she had been. And the night, just days before the end, when she took my hand in both of hers and held it with a strength that surprised me. "If anything ever happens," she had whispered, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity I did not understand, "open the bottom drawer of my desk. Promise me you'll wait until you need it. You'll know when." I had promised. I had held her hand and promised without knowing what I was agreeing to, because she was dying, and I would have promised her anything to ease the fear I saw lurking behind her calm. Now I sat in a motel room that smelled of other people's failures, holding a phone number my dead wife had hidden in my wallet, and I began to understand that Eleanor had known something was coming. She had prepared for a future she would not live to see. I reached for my phone and began to dial the number. My finger hovered over the final digit. Then the phone buzzed in my hand, and Daniel's name appeared on the screen. After 2 days of silence, after leaving his father bleeding on Christmas Eve, my son was finally calling. My hand trembled as I stared at Daniel's name glowing on the screen. For a moment, I let myself believe. I let myself imagine that my son was calling to apologize, that the events of Christmas Eve had haunted him the way they haunted me, that somewhere beneath the fear and the weakness, there was still the boy I had raised, the boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, the boy who cried when his goldfish died and insisted we hold a funeral in the backyard, the boy I loved more than my own life. Even now, even after everything, I answered the call. "Daniel, Dad." His voice was flat, businesslike, carrying none of the weight I had hoped to hear. "I've been trying to reach you. You're not at the house." "No, I'm not." A pause. I waited for him to ask where I was, how I was, whether the wound on my head had stopped bleeding. I waited for the words that would tell me my son still existed somewhere inside the stranger he had become. "Listen," Daniel said. "The mortgage payment is due on the 3rd. I checked the account and the automatic transfer didn't go through. Did you set it up? We need that payment processed by Friday, or there's going to be a late fee." The hope in my chest collapsed like a building with its foundations pulled away. He had not called to apologize. He had not called to check on me. He had called about money. After leaving me bleeding on his floor, after 2 days of absolute silence, my son's first concern was whether I had remembered to pay his mortgage. "Daniel," I said quietly, "do you want to know if I survived that night?" Silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing, could hear the television murmuring in the background of his comfortable home. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the exhausted irritation of a man dealing with an inconvenience. "Don't be dramatic, Dad. You're fine. You walked out on your own 2 feet. Now about the mortgage, I won't be paying." The words came out before I fully decided to say them. 4 words, simple and clear, carrying the weight of everything I had lost and everything I now understood. "What?" Daniel's voice sharpened. "Dad, you can't just—" I hung up. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I set it on the nightstand. I expected to feel something: anger, satisfaction, grief. Instead, there was only a hollow clarity, the strange calm that comes when you finally stop pretending. For years, I had paid their mortgage, their car loans, their credit card bills when they fell behind. I had written checks and asked no questions, believing I was helping my son build a life. Now I understood I had only been funding my own replacement. The phone rang again. I almost did not answer, expecting Daniel calling back to argue or threaten or manipulate. But the name on the screen was different. Margaret Lewis. Margaret had been Eleanor's closest friend for over 40 years. They met in college and stayed connected through marriages, children, moves across the country, and all the small disasters that make up a life. When Eleanor got sick, Margaret visited every week without fail. When Eleanor died, Margaret sat beside me at the funeral and held my hand without saying a word, because she understood that some grief is too large for language. I answered, "Walter." Her voice was worried, urgent in a way I had never heard from her. "I just heard from the Hendersons next door that you haven't been home in days. They saw your car gone Christmas night and it hasn't come back. Are you all right? Where are you?" "I'm fine, Margaret. I'm at a motel." "A motel? Walter, what happened?" I considered lying, considered protecting Daniel the way I had always protected him, but I was tired of lies, tired of protection that only enabled worse behavior. I told her about Christmas Eve, about the missing money, the confrontation, the fall, about Daniel's hands on my back and the door closing behind me. Margaret was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was heavier now, burdened with something she had been carrying alone. "Walter, listen to me. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you months ago, but Eleanor made me promise to wait. She said you'd need to hear it when the time was right, and I think the time is right now." My grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "It's about Daniel, about something that happened 5 years ago. Eleanor knew about it. She found out somehow, I don't know how, but she knew. And I think Melissa knows too." Margaret paused, and when she continued, her voice dropped low. "That's how she controls him, Walter. That's why he does whatever she says. She's been holding something over his head for years." The motel room seemed to shrink around me. The heater rattled, the highway hummed beyond the window, and Eleanor's secret phone number burned in my pocket like a promise I was only beginning to understand. "Margaret," I said slowly, "what exactly did my son do?" Margaret arrived at the Pine Ridge Motor Lodge within the hour. I watched from the window as her sedan pulled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the evening fog. She emerged carrying a plastic bag from the pharmacy and a determination in her step that reminded me so strongly of Eleanor, it made my chest ache. When I opened the door, she took one look at my face, and her expression shifted from concern to barely contained fury. She pushed past me into the room, set her bag on the bed, and pointed at the chair by the window. "Sit down," she said. "Let me see that wound." I sat. Margaret pulled supplies from her bag, proper bandages, antiseptic, butterfly closures, antibiotic ointment. She worked with the efficient hands of a woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband, who had seen enough of life's cruelties to know how to clean up after them. "This should have had stitches," she muttered, dabbing antiseptic along the gash. I winced but did not pull away. "You could have an infection. You could have a concussion. Walter, you should be in a hospital. I'll heal." "You're as stubborn as she was." Margaret's voice softened. She pressed a butterfly closure into place with gentle fingers. "Eleanor was my best friend for 40 years. I owe her this. I owe her more than I can ever repay." She finished dressing the wound and sat down on the edge of the bed across from me. The motel room felt smaller with 2 people in it, the weight of what she had come to tell me pressing against the thin walls. "I need to explain what I heard," Margaret said. "On Christmas Eve, before you arrived at Daniel's house, I stopped by that afternoon to drop off a Christmas card. Eleanor and I always exchanged cards on Christmas Eve. It was our tradition, and I wanted to keep it alive by giving one to Daniel." She paused, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap. Melissa's car was in the driveway, but no one answered when I knocked, so I let myself in through the side door. Eleanor and I used to do that all the time when she was alive. I didn't think anything of it. "What did you hear?" I sat in the living room waiting. I could hear Melissa in the kitchen, talking on the phone. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it, cold, businesslike, like she was discussing a transaction instead of a person. Margaret met my eyes. She said, "Tonight I'll handle the old man. After Christmas, everything will be ours. He won't fight back. He's too weak." The words landed like stones in still water. I had suspected Melissa's manipulation, had felt the edges of her contempt, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way I had not been prepared for. "There's more," Margaret continued. She laughed then. "It was an ugly sound, Walter." She said, "Daniel will do whatever I tell him. He doesn't have a choice. Then she hung up and I slipped out before she knew I was there. Why didn't you warn me? I tried to call you that evening, but you didn't answer. By the time I reached you, it was already too late. Margaret's face crumpled with guilt. I should have done more. I should have driven to your house and told you in person. But I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood. Maybe there was an explanation. I was a coward, Walter. I'm sorry. I reached out and took her hand. You're here now. That's what matters. Margaret squeezed my fingers, then took a breath as if steeling herself for what came next. There's something else. Something I've never told anyone, not even Eleanor, though I think she knew anyway. She looked toward the window, toward the highway lights bleeding through the fog. 5 years ago, I saw Daniel come home at 3 a.m. I couldn't sleep that night. My arthritis was acting up and I was sitting by my window when his car pulled into the driveway. He got out and just stood there in the dark for the longest time. When he finally walked to the door, I could see his face under the porch light. He was white as a ghost, Walter, shaking so badly he could barely get his keys in the lock. Did you ask him about it? I mentioned it to Eleanor the next week. She got very quiet and changed the subject. Margaret turned back to face me, but I noticed something after that night. Melissa was suddenly in charge of everything. The finances, the decisions, Daniel's schedule. He stopped disagreeing with her in public. Whatever happened that night, she's been holding it over him ever since. The pieces were beginning to form a picture I did not yet fully understand. Daniel's weakness, Melissa's control, the fear I had seen in my son's eyes when he stood over me on Christmas Eve. Something had broken him 5 years ago, and Melissa had been exploiting that break ever since. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded slip of paper from Eleanor's wallet. The phone number underlined 3 times, the single word beneath it. Emergency. Margaret, I said, holding it out to her. Do you know who this is? She took the paper and studied it. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that looked almost like relief. That's Thomas Reed, she said quietly. Eleanor's lawyer. She went to see him several times in her last months. She made me promise never to tell you about him. Margaret handed the paper back, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that reminded me why she and Eleanor had been friends for so long, unless you found that number yourself. I drove home that night with Margaret's words echoing in my mind and Eleanor's secret phone number burning in my pocket. The house where I had spent 40 years of my life sat dark against the winter sky, its windows reflecting nothing but the street lights and the bare branches of the oak tree Eleanor had planted when Daniel was born. I had not been back since Christmas Eve. Walking through the front door felt like entering a tomb. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The dishes I had been washing before driving to Daniel's house still sat in the drying rack. The Christmas cards I had received from old colleagues stood in a neat row on the mantel, unopened. Eleanor's lilies waited by the window, their soil dry and cracked from days without water. I filled the watering can and tended to them before doing anything else. Some rituals matter more than others. The house felt like a museum now, every object preserved exactly as Eleanor had arranged it during her final months. Her reading glasses still sat on the end table beside her chair. Her cardigan still hung over the back of the kitchen stool where she liked to sit while I cooked dinner. The calendar on the refrigerator still showed October, the last month she had strength enough to change it. I had not been able to bring myself to move forward without her. I walked to the study at the back of the house, the room Eleanor had claimed as her own when we first moved in. She called it her sanctuary, the place where she paid bills and wrote letters and made the phone calls that kept our lives organized. I had respected that space during our marriage, knocking before entering, never opening drawers or reading papers that were not meant for my eyes. Eleanor was entitled to her privacy. I trusted her completely. The bottom drawer of her desk had always been locked. I noticed it years ago, but never asked about it. Every person needs a place to keep the parts of themselves they are not ready to share. I assumed it held old journals, perhaps letters from before we met, keepsakes from a past that belonged only to her. Now I knelt before the desk and examined the lock with different eyes. Margaret's revelation had changed everything. Eleanor had kept secrets, yes, but not the kind I had imagined. She had been preparing for something. She had been preparing for this. I found a letter opener in the top drawer and worked it into the gap beside the lock. The wood was old and the mechanism was simple. After a few minutes of patient pressure, the lock gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty house. Inside the drawer, I found a thick folder stamped with the word confidential in red letters. A law firm's letterhead crowned the first page. Reed and Associates, Estate Planning and Trust Administration. I lifted the folder onto the desk and began to examine its contents with trembling hands. Trust documents, financial records, legal correspondence dated from Eleanor's final months, some of it signed just weeks before she died. Page after page of careful preparation, meticulous planning, language I did not fully understand but recognized as significant. Eleanor had been building something in secret, constructing a framework I was only now beginning to see. At the bottom of the stack, I found an envelope with my name written in her elegant script. The handwriting was weaker than I remembered, the letters slightly uneven, in a way that spoke of the effort it had cost her to write them. For Walter, it read, "Only open when you know the truth." As I lifted the envelope, a photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. I bent to retrieve it and found myself looking at an image I had never seen before. Eleanor sat across a desk from a silver-haired man in a wood-paneled office, a stack of documents between them. She was signing something, her pen poised over the paper with the decisive grace I remembered from 1,000 household forms and holiday cards. She was smiling, but her eyes held a fierceness. I recognized the look she got when protecting something she loved. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in her handwriting, were 2 lines that made my throat tighten. Thomas Reed. He will help you when I cannot. I set the photograph aside and opened the envelope with fingers that no longer felt like my own. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written on the pale blue stationery Eleanor had always favored. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases against the desk, and began to read. The first line stopped my breath. "My dearest Walter, if you're reading this, then I was right about her. I'm sorry I never told you. I was trying to protect you, but I was also preparing for war." The law offices of Reed and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of building that had stood for 100 years and would stand for 100 more. I arrived the next morning with Eleanor's letter in my pocket and a list of questions I was not certain I wanted answered. The receptionist led me down a hallway lined with framed diplomas and photographs of handshakes, the accumulated evidence of decades spent navigating other people's secrets. Thomas Reed rose from behind his desk when I entered. He was exactly as the photograph had shown him, silver-haired, calm, with the quiet authority of someone who had kept serious confidences and never broken them. His office smelled of old books and leather, the kind of space where important decisions were made in measured voices. He extended his hand and gripped mine with a warmth that surprised me. "Mr. Caldwell, I've been expecting you." His eyes searched my face with something like recognition. "Your wife spoke about you constantly during our meetings. She loved you more than you know." I sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair Eleanor had occupied in the photograph. The leather was worn smooth from years of clients seeking help they could not find elsewhere. Thomas settled into his own seat and folded his hands on the desk between us. "You found the drawer," he said. It was not a question. "I found it. And you read her letter, the first page. I wanted to hear the rest from you." Thomas nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he had expected. He reached into a drawer and withdrew a folder thick with documents, setting it on the desk with the reverence of a man handling something precious. "8 months before Eleanor passed," he began, "she came to my office unannounced. She was already sick by then, though she hid it well. She sat in that very chair and told me she had something to share, something she could not tell anyone else." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She had a recording on her phone. She'd overheard your daughter-in-law talking to her mother in the kitchen of your son's house. Eleanor had stepped outside to get something from her car, and the window was open. What did she hear? Melissa was discussing how to take control of your finances once Eleanor was gone. She used those exact words, the old man's money. She talked about how easy it would be, how you would never suspect, how Daniel would go along with whatever she decided." Thomas's jaw tightened. Eleanor sat in my office and played that recording 3 times. Each time her hands shook a little more. But she never cried. She just asked me what she could do to protect you. I thought of Eleanor in her final months, carrying this knowledge alone while her body failed her. She had watched Melissa smile across holiday tables, had listened to her empty compliments and false concern, had known exactly what waited for me after she was gone, and she had said nothing. Why didn't she tell me? "Because she knew you," Thomas said gently. She knew you would confront them immediately. You would demand answers, make accusations, try to fix it the way you've fixed everything your whole life. And she knew that confrontation would only make things worse. Daniel would choose Melissa. You would lose your son while she was still alive to watch it happen. He leaned forward. Eleanor decided that preparation was more important than confrontation. She spent her final months building you a fortress. He opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk. Trust documents, property transfers, financial restructuring, page after page of meticulous legal work, all of it signed in Eleanor's weakening hand. She established a revocable living trust, Thomas explained. Every major asset you own, the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, all of it was transferred into the trust. You are named as the sole trustee, which means you have complete control over everything. Daniel is listed as a beneficiary, but his access is conditional. No distribution can be made without your explicit written approval. She did all this without telling me? She did it to save you. Thomas handed me a second letter, longer than the first, covered in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. This is the full explanation she wanted you to have. In her own words, I unfolded the pages and began to read. Eleanor's voice rose from the paper as clearly as if she were sitting beside me, her hand on my arm, her eyes holding mine the way they had for 43 years. I know you would have confronted them if I told you, she wrote, but confrontation wasn't the answer, preparation was. By the time you read this, everything is in place. The house, the money, the life we built together, none of it can be touched without your explicit approval. They think they're stealing from a weak old man. They don't know they're stealing from me, and I have never lost a fight I prepared for. The letter continued for 2 more pages, explaining the legal mechanisms, the conditions she had built into the trust, the specific circumstances under which the protections would activate. She had thought of everything. She had anticipated moves Melissa had not yet made and built defenses against attacks that had not yet come. When I finished reading, my hands were shaking, but not from weakness, not from fear, from love. The kind of love that reaches beyond death and refuses to let go. Thomas waited until I looked up before speaking again. There's one more thing. During our meetings, Eleanor asked me something I didn't understand at the time. She wanted to know about insurance procedures and legal liability in hit-and-run accidents. Specifically, what happens when someone leaves the scene and the victim is seriously injured. He frowned slightly. I explained the basics, but she never told me why she was asking. I assumed it was general curiosity. Now I'm not so sure. I thought of Margaret's story. Daniel coming home at 3 a.m, white as a ghost. Melissa suddenly in control of everything. A secret held for 5 years like a weapon waiting to be used. Eleanor had known. Somehow, she had known about that too. Thomas closed the folder and met my eyes. Your wife designed this protection to activate on evidence of elder abuse, physical harm, financial exploitation, coercion. Any of these triggers the trust's defensive provisions. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle between us. With what happened on Christmas Eve, the assault, the theft, the forced removal from your son's home, we have that evidence. The question now is simple. He leaned back in his chair, his expression patient and serious. What do you want to do? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. What did I want to do? For 68 years I had lived by rules of fairness and patience, believing that decency would be repaid with decency, that the people I loved would love me in return. Christmas Eve had shattered those illusions. Now I sat in a lawyer's office holding weapons my dead wife had forged for me, and I had to decide whether I was willing to use them. I want to understand exactly what Eleanor built, I said. Every detail, every mechanism. I need to know what I'm holding before I decide how to swing it. Thomas nodded with the approval of a teacher whose student had given the right answer. He pulled a thick document from the folder and laid it flat on the desk, turning it so I could read along as he explained. The Eleanor Caldwell Family Trust, he began, pointing to the header. Established 14 months ago, funded with all major assets you and Eleanor accumulated during your marriage. The house on Maple Street, your savings accounts, your investment portfolio, even the life insurance policy, everything flows through this trust. I stared at the document, recognizing Eleanor's signature at the bottom of each page. She had done all of this while I sat beside her hospital bed reading novels aloud, while I held her hand through chemotherapy sessions, while I believed we had no secrets left between us. As trustee, Thomas continued, you have complete control over all trust assets. You decide when distributions are made, how much, and to whom. Daniel is named as a beneficiary, which means he's entitled to inherit according to the trust's terms. But here is where Eleanor was particularly clever. He flipped to a page near the middle and tapped a highlighted paragraph. This is the critical clause. Read it carefully. I leaned forward and read aloud. No distribution shall be made if the trustee determines the beneficiary is under undue influence of a third party, or if there is evidence of financial exploitation or abuse against the trustee. Eleanor essentially built a kill switch, Thomas explained. If you, as trustee, determine that Daniel is being controlled or manipulated by someone else, say, a spouse with her own agenda, you can freeze all distributions indefinitely. And if there's any evidence that you've been exploited or abused, the same protection activates automatically. The implications settled over me, like armor being strapped into place. Melissa had spent years positioning herself to inherit everything Eleanor and I had built. She had manipulated Daniel, stolen our money, orchestrated my removal from their home on Christmas Eve. And she had done all of it without realizing that every dollar she touched belonged not to me, but to Eleanor's trust. The account they've been stealing from, I said slowly. That's a trust account? Correct. When Eleanor restructured your finances, she converted your joint savings into a trust-held account. The login credentials remained the same, so from Daniel and Melissa's perspective, nothing changed. They believed they were withdrawing from a standard joint account that would pass to Daniel upon your death. Thomas's expression hardened. In reality, every unauthorized withdrawal they've made constitutes trust fraud. That's not a civil matter, Walter. That's a felony. I thought of the $47,000 that had vanished, the transactions traced to Daniel's IP address, Melissa's confident denials. They believed they were stealing from a confused old man too weak to fight back. They had no idea they were building a criminal case against themselves with every click of the mouse. There's something else I need to understand, I said. Margaret told me about something that happened to Daniel 5 years ago, a night he came home shaking, terrified. After that, Melissa took control of everything. Eleanor asked you about hit-and-run accidents. What do you know? Thomas hesitated. For the first time since I had entered his office, he looked uncertain. He removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, buying time to choose his words. Eleanor suspected something happened, he finally admitted. She never told me the specifics, but she asked me to investigate quietly. Your son covered his tracks well, no police reports, no hospital records, nothing I could find through official channels. He replaced his glasses and met my eyes. All I know is that Daniel was involved in some kind of accident. Someone was hurt, possibly seriously, and Melissa found out about it before anyone else did. The picture was becoming clearer now. Daniel's weakness, his submission to Melissa's every demand, the way he flinched when she looked at him, it all made sense if she was holding something over his head. Something criminal, something that could destroy his life if it ever came to light. So what do? I asked. Confront them? Go to the police? No. Thomas's voice was firm. Confrontation is exactly what Melissa expects. She's prepared for anger, for accusations, for an old man making noise that no one will take seriously. What she's not prepared for is patience. He leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. My advice is this: don't confront them yet. Let them continue believing they've won. Every transaction Melissa makes from this point forward is documented evidence of ongoing fraud. Every dollar she spends digs her grave a little deeper. When we move against her, we move with overwhelming force. Financial records, witness testimony, trust violations, everything laid out so clearly that no judge could ignore it. You want me to wait while they keep stealing. I want you to let them steal themselves into prison. Thomas smiled, and there was something cold in it, something that reminded me of Eleanor when she was protecting someone she loved. Your wife didn't build this trust to help you fight fair. She built it to help you win. There's a difference. I sat with that for a long moment. The anger was still there, burning low in my chest, but it was no longer the wild fire that had driven me to Daniel's door on Christmas Eve. It was something else now, something controlled, something dangerous. For the first time since that night, I felt something other than pain. I felt ready. How long do we wait? Thomas leaned back in his chair, his smile widening just slightly. Long enough for her to hang herself. February arrived with gray skies and frozen ground, the kind of winter that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I moved back into my house on Maple Street without telling anyone, slipping through the front door like a ghost returning to haunt familiar rooms. The neighbors saw my car in the driveway and assumed I had been away visiting family. I did not correct them. The less people knew about my movements, the better. Each morning I woke before dawn and tended to Eleanor's lilies, watching the pale winter light creep across the windowsill. Each evening I sat in my study reviewing the documents Thomas sent me, learning the architecture of the fortress my wife had built. And each day I watched from a distance as Melissa grew bolder, spending money she believed would soon be entirely hers. Thomas had set up alerts on all the trust accounts. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every purchase over $500 triggered a notification that landed in both our inboxes. In the first 2 weeks of February alone, I watched Melissa withdraw $8,000 for what the memo line described as home improvements. 4 days later, another $12,000 disappeared, this time labeled investment opportunity. She was spending like someone who believed the money would never run out, like someone who had already won a victory she was only now beginning to enjoy. Her social media told the same story. Daniel's account, which I suspected Melissa controlled, posted photographs of a luxury resort in Hawaii where they had booked a week-long vacation for March. The caption read, "Finally taking the trip we deserve. Sometimes you have to put yourself first." Below that, a photograph of a gleaming silver SUV parked in their driveway. New year, new wheels. Treating ourselves right. I stared at those posts for a long time, remembering the modest cars Eleanor and I had driven for decades, the vacations we had skipped to put money into Daniel's college fund, the sacrifices we had made so our son could have opportunities we never had. Melissa was burning through 40 years of careful saving like kindling in a fire, and she was documenting every flame for the world to see. But it was the pattern beneath the extravagance that caught my attention. Every Thursday, without fail, exactly $3,000 was transferred from the trust account to a bank in another state. Same amount, same day, same destination. While Melissa's other spending varied wildly, splurges on jewelry one week, restaurant bills the next, this transfer remained constant, mechanical, almost hidden among the noise of her indulgence. I asked Thomas to trace it. 2 days later, he called with the answer. "The account belongs to a woman named Diane Morrison," he said. "Melissa's mother. She lives in Nevada, just outside Las Vegas." Why would Melissa be sending her mother $3,000 every week? "I don't know yet, but I'm looking into it." Thomas paused. "Whatever the reason, it's been going on for at least 8 months. The pattern started before Eleanor died. I filed that information away, adding it to the growing picture of Melissa's secrets. $3,000 a week, 52 weeks a year. That was over $150,000 annually flowing to a woman I had met exactly twice, a woman Melissa rarely mentioned and never visited. Something was wrong there, something that went deeper than simple family obligation. In the middle of February, my phone rang with Daniel's name on the screen. I almost did not answer. Every previous call had been about money, about obligations, about the mortgage payments I had stopped making, but something made me pick up, some instinct I could not name. "Dad?" His voice sounded different, exhausted, hollow, like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "Daniel, I just wanted to check on you." He paused, and I heard him swallow hard. "Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" For a moment, I heard my real son beneath the fear and the weakness. The boy who used to bring me coffee on Saturday mornings, who called me every Sunday during his college years just to talk, who cried at his mother's funeral and held my hand through the worst of my grief. That boy was still in there somewhere, buried under 5 years of secrets and the weight of whatever Melissa held over his head. "I'm managing," I said carefully. "Are you?" He started to answer, but before he could speak, I heard Melissa's voice cut through the background, sharp and suspicious. "Who are you talking to?" Daniel's breath caught. "Nobody. Just it's nothing." "Daniel, who is on the phone?" "I have to go," he said quickly, his voice flattening back into the hollow tone I had come to expect. "Take care of yourself, Dad." The line went dead. I sat holding the phone for a long time afterward, thinking about the fear I had heard in my son's voice, the way he had flinched at the sound of his wife's words. Whatever had happened 5 years ago, whatever secret Melissa was holding, It had turned my son into a prisoner in his own home. 2 days later, Thomas called with news that made me smile for the first time in weeks. "Melissa tried to make a purchase this morning," he said. $15,000 at a jewelry store downtown. The card was declined. Declined? There's still money in the account. There is. But I flagged the account for review yesterday, standard procedure when there's suspected fraud. Now every transaction over a certain amount requires additional authorization from the primary account holder. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. She called the bank demanding an explanation. The representative told her the account was under review and that all major transactions would need to be approved going forward. I imagined Melissa standing in that jewelry store, card in hand, confident smile frozen on her face as the clerk shook her head. I imagined her calling the bank, her voice rising from polite inquiry to outraged demand. I imagined the first crack appearing in the wall of certainty she had built around herself. "What happens now?" "Now," Thomas said, "we wait for her to panic. Desperate people make desperate mistakes, and I have a feeling Melissa is about to make the biggest mistake of her life." The call from Margaret came 3 days after the card was declined. Her voice was barely above a whisper, urgent and afraid in a way I had never heard from her before. "Walter, you need to hear this. Right now. Don't say anything. Just listen." I heard a rustling sound, then the muffled thump of something being pressed against a wall. Margaret's house shared a property line with Daniel's, separated by nothing but a thin fence and 30 feet of winter-dead grass. Through the phone, I heard shouting loud enough to carry through walls, through windows, through all the barriers that usually keep a marriage's ugliness hidden from the world. Melissa's voice came first, sharp and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The account is frozen. Frozen. I tried to buy one thing, one simple thing, and they declined me like I'm some kind of criminal." Daniel's response was harder to hear, his voice lower, defensive. "I didn't do anything. Maybe Dad figured it out. Maybe the bank. The bank doesn't just freeze accounts, for no reason. Something crashed a dish, a glass, something fragile meeting something hard. Someone reported us. Someone is watching, and you're just standing there like the useless coward you've always been." "Don't call me that." Daniel's voice rose, cracking with an emotion I had not heard from him in years. "Don't you dare call me that. I've done everything you asked. Everything. I pushed my own father to the ground. I let you steal from him. I've lied and cheated and destroyed my family because you told me I had no choice. You don't have a choice." Melissa's voice dropped to something worse than shouting, a cold, controlled contempt that made my skin crawl even through the phone. "You never had a choice. Not since that night. That was 5 years ago. And it will follow you for the rest of your life unless I protect you." I heard footsteps, the creak of floorboards under angry weight. Who paid off that woman? Who made sure she never went to the police? Who kept you out of prison when you deserved to rot there? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had changed, desperate now, pleading. "You promised you'd never use that against me again. You promised, Melissa. After I agreed to everything, after I gave you control of the finances and stopped arguing and did whatever you wanted, you swore you'd never throw it in my face. Promises change when circumstances change." Her voice was ice. "And right now, our circumstances have changed significantly. I can't do this anymore." Daniel's voice broke on the last word. "I can't keep living like this. Maybe I should just tell him. Tell everyone. Go to the police myself. And what? Confess to a hit and run that left a woman bleeding in the street?" Melissa laughed, and the sound was ugly, triumphant. "You hit someone with your car and drove away, Daniel. You left a young mother lying on the pavement while you ran home and cried like a child. Do you want your father to know that? Do you want the police to know? Because I still have the evidence. I have the repair receipts. I have the photos of the damage to your car. I have everything I need to destroy you." My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles went white. The full picture finally came into focus, sharp and terrible. 5 years ago, my son had made a choice that shattered 2 lives, the woman he struck and his own. He had been driving drunk after a work party, had hit a pedestrian, had panicked and fled instead of stopping to help. The next morning, paralyzed with guilt and fear, he had confessed to his wife. And Melissa, instead of helping him face the consequences, had seen an opportunity. She paid off the victim $80,000, according to what Thomas had traced, money that had come from accounts I never knew existed. She gathered the evidence, documented everything, and locked it away like a weapon to be used whenever Daniel stepped out of line. From that moment on, my son had belonged to her. Every decision he made, every betrayal of his father, every dollar he helped her steal, all of it, was the price of her silence. He was not just weak, he was imprisoned, trapped in a cage of his own making with a jailer who would never let him forget the bars. Now, Melissa continued, her voice carrying clearly through Margaret's phone, you are going to call your father. You are going to convince him to sign over the house. I don't care what you have to say, what lies you have to tell, what promises you have to make. You will get that signature, Daniel, or I will end your life with one phone call to the police. I heard Daniel make a sound that might have been a sob or might have been the last gasp of a man who had finally stopped fighting. The line went quiet except for the distant thump of a door slamming, then footsteps retreating into silence. Margaret's voice returned, shaky and close. Walter, are you still there? I'm here. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never imagined. It's not your fault. I sat in Eleanor's chair, staring at the lilies on the windowsill, processing what I had just learned. My son was guilty of a terrible crime. My daughter-in-law had used that crime to enslave him. And now, with her access to money threatened, she was tightening the chains. What are you going to do? Margaret asked. I thought about Eleanor's trust, the evidence Thomas was compiling, the weapon Melissa believed she held over Daniel's head. She thought she was the only one with leverage. She thought she was the only one who had been preparing. She was wrong. I'm going to wait for Daniel to call, I said. And when he does, I'm going to give him something his wife never has. What's that? I looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the mantel, her fierce eyes, her knowing smile. She had seen this coming. She had prepared me for exactly this moment. A way out. The doorbell rang the next morning while I was watering Eleanor's lilies. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see Melissa's silhouette alone, without Daniel, her posture different from anything I had seen before. She stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, her head bowed, the body language of someone approaching with humility rather than demands. I set down the watering can and opened the door. Melissa's face was a masterpiece of contrition. Her eyes glistened with what might have been tears. Her smile was soft, uncertain, nothing like the sharp-edged expression she usually wore. She clutched a folder against her chest like a shield. Walter. Her voice trembled slightly. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but please can we talk? Just for a few minutes? I stepped aside and let her in. She walked past me into the living room, her eyes scanning the space as if cataloging its contents. She sat on the edge of the sofa, folder balanced on her knees, and waited for me to join her. I owe you an apology, she began. What happened at Christmas, it was unforgivable. The stress of the holidays, the pressure Daniel and I have been under with our finances, it all just boiled over. I said things I didn't mean. Things happened that never should have happened. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that appeared from nowhere. I've been carrying so much guilt, Walter. I haven't been able to sleep. I keep thinking about you alone in this house, thinking we don't care about you. I watched her performance with the detachment of a man who had already seen the truth behind the curtain. 24 hours ago, I had listened through Margaret's phone as this same woman threatened to destroy my son's life with a single phone call. Now she sat in my living room pretending to cry. What do you want, Melissa? She flinched slightly at my directness, then recovered with a sad smile. I want us to start over. I want to be a family again. Daniel misses you so much, he talks about you all the time. We both just want things to go back to the way they were. And the folder? She looked down at it as if surprised to find it in her hands. Oh, this. It's nothing really. Just some paperwork Daniel and I have been discussing. A way to simplify things for the future. Make sure everyone is protected. She opened the folder and produced a document, sliding it across the coffee table toward me. It's called a quitclaim deed. Completely standard. It just transfers ownership of the house to Daniel, so you don't have to worry about property taxes and maintenance and all those headaches anymore. I picked up the document and examined it slowly, reading every line, every clause, every piece of legal language. The deed was exactly what she described, a surrender of all my ownership rights in the property, transferring them entirely to Daniel Caldwell. At the bottom, spaces waited for signatures. Melissa had even brought a notary, a nervous-looking young woman who sat in a car parked at the curb, visible through the front window. You've thought of everything, I said. I just want to make this easy for you. Melissa's smile widened. One signature and it's done. No lawyers, no fees, no complications. The notary is right outside. We can have this filed by lunch. I continued reading, asking questions in a mild, confused voice. Where exactly did I sign? What happened after the filing? How long until the transfer was complete? Melissa answered each question with growing confidence, her earlier pretense of humility fading as she sensed victory approaching. The county recorder processes these within a few days, she explained. Once it's recorded, Daniel's name will be on the title. Simple as that. And the house is mine to give? There's nothing that would prevent this transfer? Of course it's yours. Melissa laughed lightly. You and Eleanor bought it 40 years ago. It's your property to do with as you wish. She had no idea. All those months of accessing our accounts, all those stolen thousands, and she had never once discovered that Eleanor had restructured everything. She believed she was stealing from a joint account when she was actually committing trust fraud. She believed this house was my personal property when it had been titled to the Eleanor Caldwell Family Trust for over a year. I picked up the pen Melissa had provided and signed my name at the bottom of the quitclaim deed. Her eyes lit up with a hunger she could not quite conceal. She snatched the document from my hands before the ink was dry, practically leaping from the sofa. Thank you, Walter. You won't regret this. I'll make sure everything is filed properly. We'll talk soon about getting you some help around the house. Maybe a nice assisted living place where you can relax. And she was already moving toward the door, her words trailing behind her like an afterthought. Through the window, I watched her wave the notary over, watched them complete the remaining signatures on the hood of her car, watched Melissa slide behind the wheel with the satisfied smile of a woman who believed she had finally won. She drove away without looking back. I returned to Eleanor's lilies and resumed watering them, taking my time, letting the minutes pass. Thomas had prepared me for this moment. He had explained exactly what would happen when Melissa tried to file that deed, exactly how the system would respond to her attempt. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Thomas's name glowed on the screen. It's done, he said. She filed the quitclaim at the county recorder's office about an hour ago. They rejected it immediately. On what grounds? The property is titled to the Eleanor Caldwell Family Trust. You, as trustee, cannot transfer trust assets through a quitclaim deed. The filing was invalid from the moment she submitted it. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. But here's the important part. The county recorder flagged the filing as a potential attempt at trust fraud. They're required by law to report suspicious filings to the district attorney's office. I set down the watering can and looked at Eleanor's photograph on the mantel. She was smiling, as always, her eyes fierce with the knowledge of everything she had prepared. So Melissa just created a paper trail. A very detailed paper trail, Thomas confirmed. One that shows she attempted to fraudulently transfer trust property using a document she pressured the trustee to sign under false pretenses. Combined with the financial records we've been gathering, this gives the DA everything they need to open a formal investigation. She doesn't know yet. No. Right now she's probably driving home, planning how to spend money she thinks she just secured. Thomas paused. She has no idea that she just handed us the evidence to destroy her. I thanked him and ended the call. Outside, the winter sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. I thought about Melissa's confident smile as she drove away, her certainty that she had finally beaten the weak old man who stood in her way. She would learn soon enough. Eleanor had been right about everything, and the war she had prepared me for was about to begin in earnest. March arrived with the first signs of spring pushing through the frozen ground, green shoots emerging from soil that had seemed dead only weeks before. The season of renewal had come, and with it, the reckoning I had been preparing for since Christmas Eve. Adult Protective Services opened their formal investigation on the 3rd of the month. The case file landed on a supervisor's desk with the weight of overwhelming evidence. Thomas's meticulous documentation of every fraudulent withdrawal, Margaret's sworn testimony about what she had witnessed and overheard, the rejected quitclaim deed that showed clear intent to defraud. The investigator assigned to my case, a sharp-eyed woman named Rodriguez, told me she had rarely seen such a complete picture of elder financial abuse. Most cases take months to build, she said during our second meeting. Yours arrived fully formed. Someone did exceptional work preparing this. I thought of Eleanor in her final months, signing documents while cancer consumed her body, building walls I would not need until she was gone. Someone did, I agreed. On the 15th of March, I formally activated the protective clause in Eleanor's trust. As trustee, I had the authority to suspend all beneficiary rights when evidence of financial exploitation existed. The legal notice was delivered to Daniel and Melissa by certified mail, informing them that their access to all trust assets was immediately frozen and that they had 30 days to vacate the property where they had been living, a property that, like everything else they believed they owned, belonged to the Eleanor Caldwell Family Trust. Melissa's response was swift and predictable. She hired a lawyer, a loud man in an expensive suit, who filed motions claiming I was mentally incompetent, that I had been manipulated by outside influences, that the trust itself was invalid because Eleanor had clearly been suffering from dementia when she created it. He demanded an emergency hearing, painting me as a confused old man being exploited by scheming neighbors and greedy attorneys. The court appointed Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist with 30 years of experience, evaluating cognitive function in elderly patients. She interviewed me for 2 hours in a quiet office that smelled of lavender and old books. She asked me questions about current events, about my daily routines, about complex financial concepts and family relationships. She gave me puzzles to solve and memories to recall and scenarios to navigate. Her conclusion, delivered to the court in a 12-page report, was unambiguous. Mr. Walter Caldwell demonstrates exceptional cognitive function and emotional stability for a man of any age. His memory is sharp, his reasoning is sound, and his understanding of his financial and legal situation is comprehensive. He is fully competent to manage his own affairs and to serve as trustee of his late wife's estate. Melissa's lawyer withdrew from the case 2 days later. I heard through Thomas that he had discovered the full extent of what his client had done and wanted no part of defending it. The 30th day fell on a Saturday. I woke early and dressed carefully, choosing the suit Eleanor had always liked best. The navy one, she said, made me look distinguished. I drove to Daniel's house, the trust's house, and parked across the street, in almost exactly the same spot where I had sat on Christmas Eve watching my family laugh without me. The sheriff's cruiser arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. 2 deputies approached the front door with an eviction notice in hand. I watched from the sidewalk as Melissa answered, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally incandescent rage. "You can't do this." Her voice carried across the quiet neighborhood, shrill enough to bring curious faces to windows up and down the street. "This is my house. I live here. You have no right." The deputies remained calm, professional, unmoved by her screaming. They explained the legal situation in flat, patient voices. The property belonged to the Eleanor Caldwell Family Trust. The occupants had been given 30 days' notice to vacate. That notice had expired. They could leave voluntarily or be removed by force. Margaret watched from her porch, her arms crossed, her expression grim with satisfaction. Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. The woman who had spent years cultivating an image of respectability, who had smiled and waved and pretended to be the perfect daughter-in-law, was being escorted from a house that had never belonged to her while the entire street watched. The deputies guided Melissa toward their cruiser. She was not being arrested, not yet, but they were required to ensure she left the property. Her screaming had subsided into bitter muttering, her eyes scanning the gathered witnesses with pure hatred. Then Daniel emerged from the house. He looked worse than I had ever seen him, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that looked slept in. He stopped on the front porch and stared at me across the lawn, and something in his expression cracked. He broke away from the deputy who reached for his arm and ran toward me, his feet slipping on the wet grass. Before I could react, he dropped to his knees in front of me, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. "Dad," his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For everything. For Christmas. For the money. For letting her," he choked on the words. "I'm sorry." I looked down at my son, kneeling in the mud, broken and ashamed, and finally, after 5 years of lies, honest. Behind him, Melissa screamed his name, demanding he get up, demanding he stop embarrassing her. He did not move. I said nothing. There would be time for words later, time for explanations and consequences, and perhaps, eventually, forgiveness. But not yet. Not here. Some wounds need to be acknowledged before they can begin to heal. I simply stood there, letting my silence speak for everything I was not yet ready to say. April brought warm rain and the arrest of my daughter-in-law. The charges were read in a courtroom I did not attend. Elder financial abuse, attempted trust fraud, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The prosecutor told me the combined charges carried a potential sentence of 5 to 12 years. Melissa stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit. Her carefully maintained composure finally shattered and pleaded not guilty to everything. I learned the details of the investigation from Detective Morrison, a patient man with tired eyes who had spent 20 years untangling the lies people tell about money. He came to my house on a Tuesday afternoon, sat in Eleanor's chair without being invited, and told me things I had not expected to hear. We traced those weekly transfers, he said, $3,000 every Thursday to an account in Nevada. The account belongs to Diane Morrison, Melissa's mother. I know. My lawyer found that months ago. What you don't know is why. Morrison leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Diane has a gambling problem. Severe. She's been in and out of programs for 15 years, never stuck with any of them. About 2 years ago, she got in deep with some underground lenders in Las Vegas, the kind of people who don't file lawsuits when you miss payments. I felt something shift in my chest, a premonition of where this story was heading. How deep? Over $180,000. And 3 months before Christmas, those people stopped being patient. They made threats, specific threats. They told Diane that if she didn't start paying, they would hurt her, maybe kill her. Morrison sat back, watching my face. Melissa found out in September. She'd been sending money for years, trying to keep her mother afloat. But this was different. This was life and death. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. I thought about Melissa's frantic spending, the way she had accelerated her theft after the holidays, the desperation I had mistaken for greed. She had not been building a fortune. She had been trying to save her mother's life. She made terrible choices, Morrison continued. Criminal choices. But she wasn't doing it for jewelry and vacations. She was doing it because she believed her mother would be killed if she didn't come up with the money. I sat with that knowledge for a long time after Morrison left. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Eleanor had inherited from her parents. I thought about daughters and mothers, about the lengths we go to protect the people we love, about the secrets we keep and the sins we commit in the name of family. Melissa was not evil in the simple way I had imagined. She was a daughter who had watched her mother spiral into addiction and debt, who had received threats she believed were real, who had made choices that destroyed lives, including her own, because she could not see another way. She was wrong. She was criminal. But she was also, in her own twisted way, trying to do what Eleanor had done for me. The next morning, I visited the prosecutor's office. The assistant district attorney was a young woman with sharp eyes and a folder full of evidence against my daughter-in-law. She expected me to push for maximum penalties, to demand restitution, to want blood. I'm not dropping the charges, I told her. What she did was wrong. She needs to face the consequences. Of course, Mr. Caldwell, we intend to pursue, but I'm waiving my right to personal restitution. I watched her expression shift from satisfaction to confusion. Whatever money is recovered, use it to get her mother into treatment. A real program, residential, long-term, and keep my name off it. I don't need Melissa's gratitude, and I don't want it. The prosecutor tried to argue, but I held firm. Eleanor had taught me that justice and mercy were not opposites. You could demand accountability while still leaving room for grace. Melissa would go to prison, but her mother might finally get the help she needed. That felt like something Eleanor would have wanted. I was nearly to the door when Detective Morrison caught up with me in the hallway. Mr. Caldwell, there's one more thing. His voice was careful, measured. Your son has been cooperating with our investigation, fully cooperating. He's given us everything, bank records, emails, testimony about how Melissa controlled him. I stopped walking. Daniel is cooperating? More than cooperating. Morrison met my eyes with something that might have been respect. He's ready to testify about everything, including what happened 5 years ago. The accident, the cover-up, all of it. Thomas called me that same afternoon, his voice carrying a weight I had not heard from him before. Walter, your son just left my office. I think you need to know what happened." I sat down in Eleanor's chair and listened as Thomas described the visit. Daniel had arrived unannounced, walking through the door like a man approaching his own execution. He had aged 10 years in 4 months, gaunt, exhausted, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been robust. But his eyes were different, Thomas said, clear for the first time. The fog of fear and shame had finally lifted. "Why are you here?" Thomas had asked him. Daniel's answer came slowly, each word pulled from somewhere deep. "I need to know what my mother knew about me. I need to know if she hated me when she died." Thomas paused in his telling, and I heard him take a breath. "Walter, Eleanor left something else. Something I wasn't supposed to tell you about unless Daniel came looking for it himself." My hand tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "A second letter. She wrote one for you and one for him. She made me promise to keep Daniel's sealed until he asked for it on his own. She said he would, eventually. She said he just needed time to find his way back." I closed my eyes and saw her face, my Eleanor, always 3 steps ahead, always preparing for futures she would never live to see. Even in death, she had been waiting for our son to come home. Thomas continued. He described opening the safe, removing the small envelope with Daniel's name written in Eleanor's elegant script. He described the way Daniel's hands trembled as he broke the seal, the way his breath caught when he recognized his mother's handwriting. Then Thomas read me the letter. He had made a copy, with Eleanor's permission written into her instructions, in case Daniel ever needed to hear the words again. "My dear son," Eleanor had written, "if you're reading this, it means you finally found the courage I knew you had. I know about the accident. I know about the woman you hurt. I know about the guilt you've carried and the prison Melissa built around you with your own shame as the bars." Thomas's voice was steady, but I could hear the emotion beneath it. "I don't hate you. I never could. You are my child, the boy I held when he was afraid of thunderstorms, the young man who made me proud in 1,000 small ways before one terrible night changed everything. But I refused to rescue you from consequences you needed to face. Some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be learned through suffering." I thought of Daniel as a child, crawling into our bed during storms, his small body pressed against mine for safety. I thought of him as a teenager, so desperate to prove himself, so afraid of disappointing us. I thought of the man he had become, trapped in a cage of his own making, too ashamed to ask for help. "The only path back to yourself runs straight through the truth," Eleanor's letter continued. "Tell your father everything. Let him decide what comes next. He is stronger than you know, and his love is deeper than your mistakes. And remember, I loved you first, and I love you last. Even when you forgot how to love yourself, your mother, Eleanor." Thomas told me that Daniel broke down completely when he finished reading. He wept in a way Thomas had never seen a grown man weep, great, shuddering sobs that seemed to tear loose from somewhere he had kept locked for 5 years. Thomas let him cry without interruption, without offering false comfort, without trying to make it better. Some grief needs to be expressed fully before it can begin to heal. When Daniel finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, his voice barely a whisper, he asked the only question that mattered. "How do I face him after everything?" Thomas handed him a tissue and waited until Daniel's breathing steadied. "Your father is at home right now," he said. "He's been waiting for you to ask that question." I thanked Thomas and ended the call. Then I walked to the window where Eleanor's lilies bloomed in the afternoon light. My son was coming home, not the broken puppet Melissa had controlled, not the coward who had pushed me to the ground, but the man Eleanor always believed he could become. I stood by the window and waited. I saw his car pull into the driveway from the window where I stood watering Eleanor's lilies. The engine idled for a long time, exhaust rising in thin wisps against the cool spring air. Through the windshield, I could see Daniel's silhouette, motionless, staring at the house where he had grown up. 20 minutes passed. I did not go outside. I did not wave or call to him. This was a journey he needed to complete on his own terms. Finally, the engine died. The car door opened. My son stepped out and stood for another moment, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the porch, the oak tree he used to climb, the window of the bedroom where he had slept for 18 years. Then he walked toward the front door with the slow, deliberate steps of a man approaching something he had been running from his entire adult life. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. I set down the watering can, dried my hands on the dish towel Eleanor had embroidered with small blue flowers, and opened the door. Daniel stood on the threshold, his hands shaking at his sides. He looked worse than he had at the eviction, if that was possible, thinner, paler, the bones of his face sharp beneath skin that seemed stretched too tight. But his eyes were different. The fear was still there, but beneath it I saw something I had not seen in years. Clarity, resolve, the willingness to face whatever came next without flinching. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw past the gaunt stranger he had become. I saw the frightened boy who had made a terrible mistake one night 5 years ago, who had compounded that mistake with lies and cowardice, who had lost himself so completely in the prison of his own shame that he had forgotten who he was. He was not the weak man Melissa had created. He was my child, broken and ashamed, finally ready to stop hiding. I stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in. Coffee's fresh." Daniel's breath caught, as if he had expected me to slam the door in his face. He crossed the threshold slowly, his eyes moving across the living room, taking in the familiar furniture, the photographs on the walls, the lilies blooming by the window. When his gaze landed on Eleanor's portrait above the mantel, he stopped walking and stared at her face for a long time. I led him to the kitchen, to the table where he had eaten breakfast every morning of his childhood, where he had done homework and blown out birthday candles and argued with his mother about curfews. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. Then I sat across from him and waited. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything that needed to be said. Daniel wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, but did not drink. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, on his own trembling fingers, on anything but my face. Then he began to talk. He told me about the night 5 years ago, the work party, the drinks he should not have had, the decision to drive home anyway because he was Daniel Caldwell, responsible and careful, and nothing bad ever happened to people like him. He told me about the woman crossing the street, the impact he felt through the steering wheel, the terrible moment when he looked in the rearview mirror and saw her lying motionless on the pavement. He told me how he panicked, how he drove away instead of stopping, instead of calling for help, instead of doing any of the things a decent person would do. He told me about the sleepless night that followed, the horror of what he had done settling into his bones like poison. He told me about confessing to Melissa the next morning, expecting her to help him turn himself in, expecting her to stand by him while he faced the consequences. Instead, she had seen an opportunity. Daniel described the years that followed in a flat, hollow voice. The payoff Melissa arranged, the evidence she gathered, the slow tightening of her control over every aspect of his life. He did not make excuses. He did not blame her for choices that were ultimately his own. He simply told the truth, all of it, letting it pour out of him like water from a broken dam. When he finished, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat with his words, letting them settle, feeling their weight. My son had done something terrible. He had compounded that terrible thing with cowardice and lies. He had allowed himself to be controlled, had participated in stealing from me, had pushed me to the ground on Christmas Eve. But he was also sitting across from me now, telling the truth without asking for anything in return. That counted for something. "You need to make this right," I said finally. "The woman you hit, she deserves to know you're sorry. She deserves to hear it from you directly, not through lawyers or insurance settlements. That's not my forgiveness to give." Daniel nodded slowly, tears sliding down his cheeks. "I know. I've already contacted her through my lawyer. She agreed to meet with me next week. I'm prepared to face whatever comes after that. If she wants to press charges, I won't fight it. I'm done running." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw something I had feared was lost forever. The boy I raised was still in there, buried beneath years of fear and shame. He was climbing his way back to the surface, one painful truth at a time. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. His fingers were cold, trembling, but he did not pull away. "That's the first thing you've done in 5 years that sounds like my son." Daniel's face crumpled. He wept then, not the desperate sobs Thomas had described, but quieter tears of release and relief. I let him cry. Some things cannot be rushed. When the tears subsided, I stood and walked to the mantel. I lifted Eleanor's photograph from its place of honor and carried it back to the table, setting it between us so she could be part of this moment she had worked so hard to make possible. "Your mother never gave up on you," I said. "She knew about the accident. She knew about Melissa. She prepared everything, the trust, the letters, The protections because she believed you would find your way back eventually. I touched the edge of the frame, the familiar silver that had held her image for so many years. She just couldn't save you until you were ready to save yourself. Daniel looked at his mother's face, at the knowing smile and fierce eyes I had loved for 43 years. I watched understanding dawn in his expression, watched him finally grasp what Eleanor had done and why. She protected both of us, he whispered, just in different ways. Yes, she did. The next morning, I woke at dawn as I always did, and walked to the windowsill where Eleanor's lilies waited. I filled the watering can, tested the soil with my finger, began the careful ritual I had performed every day for over a year. But this morning, I was not alone. Daniel stood beside me, watching my movements, learning the rhythm of care that his mother had taught me, without my ever realizing it. I showed him how much water to use, how to check for yellowing leaves, how to turn the pot so every bloom received equal light. She always said these flowers needed attention every single day, I said quietly, watching the water soak into the soil. I thought she meant the lilies. I looked at my son, standing in the morning light, damaged and healing and finally, fully present. Now I know she meant us. And that was my story. A story about betrayal and redemption, about secrets kept out of love and truths that set us free. Eleanor knew from the beginning what I would face after she was gone, and she spent her final months building armor I did not know I needed. She could not protect me with her presence, so she protected me with her preparation, and in doing so, she also saved our son from a prison of his own making. Melissa is serving her sentence now. I do not visit her, but I made sure her mother received the help she needed. Some cycles of destruction deserve to be broken, even when the people caught in them have caused us pain. Daniel and I are rebuilding what was lost, one conversation at a time, one morning at a time, one shared moment beside the lilies his mother planted. It is not easy. Trust, once shattered, takes years to reassemble. But we are trying. That is all Eleanor ever asked of us. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved was protecting you in ways you never knew? Have you faced betrayal from family and found your way back to forgiveness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories remind me that none of us walk this road alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the end. And if Eleanor's story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that love, even silent love, never truly lets go.